Good day. My name is Elsen. I'm a scientist at the Soil Service of Belgium. In the next 10 minutes, I would like to invite you to learn more about effects, both short-term and long-term, of compost amendments on the soil quality of arable land. More than 20 years ago, at the Soil Service of Belgium, we wondered whether somehow vegetable, fruit and garden waste could be used by turning it into a valuable product and to be applied to our arable fields in order to increase soil quality and soil fertility. In order to answer that question, in 1997, we set up an experimental field on a farmer's field in Belgium with a typical crop rotation. Since then, with the financial support of both VLACO and the province of Vlaams-Brabant, we have been able to investigate the effect of compost applications, varying in dosages, but also varying in frequency of application, on the crop yield and also on the soil quality. Of course, we also included some necessary controls, like a mineral fertilized control, where all necessary nutrients were made available through the application of mineral fertilizers. Besides that control, we also included an unfertilized control and a fallow. On the picture at the right bottom of this slide, you see a satellite image of our experimental field, and the white squares actually show you the fallow experimental plots. Now let's first have a look at the impact of compost on the soil fertility and on the crop yield. In this graph, I show you the yields of the first, let's say, 23 years in this experimental field. And in order to compare the different crops with each other, we set the mineral fertilized yield at 100 as a reference, let's say. In a mineral fertilized plot, we assume that the optimal yield can be reached. In the blue line shows you the relative yield of the control or unfertilized treatment, which is obviously much lower than the mineral fertilized treatment. And then of interest to us is the green line, the compost treatments, where you can see that in the first period between 1997 and 2004, we do see that there is a fertilizing effect through the compost amendment, because the green line is higher than the blue line. However, it will not reach the orange line. If you look at the second part of the graph, you can see that from 2004 onwards, indeed, the green line is flirting with the orange line. That is because from that moment on, we added, if necessary, mineral fertilizers to the compost treatments in order to fulfill the fertilization advice. So from 2004 onwards, both in the compost treatments as well as in the mineral fertilized treatment, the same amount of nutrients were available to the crop. However, if you look closely to the graph, the green graph from 2004, you can see that this green graph is flirting more with the upper side of the yellow line than the lower side. So in many years, we do observe that there is a slightly higher yield in the compost amended treatments, although they receive the same amount of nutrients. So why is that? That brings me to the carbon effect. By amending compost to our experimental plots, as you can see on the middle and right side of this graph, this results in an increase in carbon. If we apply every year 15 tons of compost, you can see that there is a gradual but sure increase of the carbon content in your soil, where we reach after 20 years, we can increase from 1% to 1.5%. If we apply higher dosages, like 45 tons of compost, which is an extremely high dosage, but there you can clearly see that there is a significant and steeper increase, and we double over a period of 20 years the carbon content in the soil. And it is exactly this carbon effect that is so beneficial, which is so beneficial to our soils. Let me show you in the next slides some results where we look a bit more into detail on the effects or at the effects of carbon on the soil quality. Soil quality, as we all know, is actually the basis of a good soil quality because it impacts both chemical, physical, but also the biological soil quality. On this slide, I show you some results from measurements that we did on the compost trial, where we used two different techniques, a chloroform fumigation extraction and a substrate-induced respiration experiment, both techniques used to measure microbial biomass. And if you look at the results of this experiment, it is obvious that in those treatments where we applied compost and where we had a higher carbon content, we also observed more microbial biomass. So more soil life as a consequence of the increase in organic carbon. Not only is there more microbial biomass, but if we look into the biodiversity, of this microbial soil life, we did an analysis where we identified unique species of fungi in the different treatments. And if you look in the graph on the left side and you add up all the figures which stand for unique fungal species in the compost amended experimental plots, you can see that in these compost-treated soils, we had the highest biodiversity. So by adding compost and by increasing the carbon content in our soil, we increased microbial biomass, but not only was there more soil life, there was also a more diverse soil life. Moving on to another aspect, the physical soil quality. Again, I show you some data from our compost trial, and on the x-axis you see the increase in carbon as we have measured it in the different experimental plots. So the compost amended treatments are situated on the right side of this graph. You can see that as organic carbon increases, there is also a significant increase in water content. So by adding compost to the soil, your soil will be able to retain more water. Not only is the water content higher, but since organic carbon and this very active soil life, they both interact and they will improve significantly the structure of your soil. And as a consequence of that, we can also observe in this compost trial that this leads to significantly higher infiltration rates. So by adding compost, we increase water retention, but we also increase water infiltration. Two very important features, especially if we keep climate change in mind. And then finally, the chemical soil quality. To show you some data on that, you can see here a graph with results from an incubation experiment which was performed in the laboratory, but where we incubated soils from the different treatments of the compost trial in order to determine their mineralization capacity. The two lower lines, the blue and the green one, are the soils with the lowest carbon content, the unfertilized or the mineral fertilized soils. And you can see that they also have the lowest mineralization capacity. In contrast, the compost amended soils with significantly higher carbon content also have significantly higher mineralization capacity. This is a very important feature for farmers, but they have to, because the soil will deliver more nitrogen through mineralization. However, you have to adapt your fertilization strategy accordingly. And that's something I want to show you in this final graph, where in blue you see the fertilization advice, nitrogen fertilization advice for the mineral fertilized experimental plots. And then in the different greens, you see the nitrogen fertilization advice for the different compost treatments. And you see that with an increasing frequency of application, but also with an increase in dosage, you can see that the nitrogen fertilization advice will decrease. So adding compost, increasing carbon, this will result in a higher nitrogen mineralization and as a consequence, a lower nitrogen fertilization advice. This brings me to my last slide, and I hope that by showing you these data from this very unique long-term field experiment, I hope that I could convince you that by turning in vegetable, fruit and garden waste into a highly qualitative compost, and by adding this compost to our arable fields, that we are able to significantly increase not only soil fertility, but on the long term also soil quality. Thank you very much.